Greetings, my name is Nero and welcome to Game Summary. This video is really long. You don't have to watch the whole thing, I have instructions for you. First, watch the PC88 portion of this video which comes right after this intro. I'm basing every segment of the summary on that version, so you have to know its contents. After that, if you are only looking to find out if you want to play Ys I&II, watch Ys Eternal, Ys Complete and Ys Chronicles portions of this video. You can find the time tags for each version in the description. And if you are interested in any other versions, you are free to watch those too. With that said, let's just go get it over with. Ancient Ys Vanished Omen, which is more commonly known as Ys I, is an action role-playing game by Nihon Falcom. It was released in 1987 for the NEC PC8801 in Japan. You play as adult Kristin, a young adventurer. He hears of Esteria, a land that is said to be cursed. He sails to Esteria through a storm wall that has sealed it away from the rest of the world, in order to discover the truth. In Esteria, a fortune teller tells Adol about the books of Ys and that he must find them to solve the mystery of the land and the history of Ys. A lot of this is told in the game's manual. The game actually begins at the town in Esteria. Ys had a very unique narrative for its time. It's set on a small island instead of a large world, having an excellent sense of scale. For its small size and length, Ys has a lot of dialogue and foreshadowing. The first game mainly serves as a build-up for the revelations in the second game. A theme of prospects and dangers of power is very important in the first two games, and the way they handle magic and monsters was prominent at the end of the 80s, and its approach was made more popular far later. The story is told through dialogue with NPCs, but it also has some visual implications, which is pretty impressive for a game from 1987. Ys I is most well known for its bump system. You equip a sword to increase your strength, and armor at the shield for defense, but you do not swing a sword or block with a shield. Instead you have to run at enemies. If you run at them straight on, you take damage. You have to hit a sweet spot off center to deal damage and take none in return. This way you can push an enemy forward while dealing damage. This creates an excellent flow of gameplay where you can keep fighting as you move. You also receive experience points and gold automatically as you defeat an enemy. It makes backtracking and traversing the world easy, and it also makes finding fun and convenient. I heard the director of the game compared the gameplay to popping bubble wrap, which is a very fitting comparison. There are a few other things to note about the bump system. The first thing is that because movement is grid-based, Adol and monsters move one square at a time. Because of this, if you start pushing an enemy at a specific moment, they will try to move too, sometimes resulting into two opposing movements desyncing, and the enemy doing a 90-degree turn towards Adol as they get to move one square before Adol has taken his next step. This is more prominent with some enemies in the game and also depends on how fast they move. It can be annoying but can be avoided by doing a few bumps at a time, or less plausibly by learning to find the right moment to start pushing an enemy. Also, if you push an enemy towards a wall, they will pass through you behind you. You can simply turn around and start pushing them towards another direction with the right timing. Ys also has a rest feature. If Adol stands still for a while, his health points will regain slowly. This only works outside dungeons, but there is a ring that will let you rest inside dungeons too. Adol is still under the mercy of monsters, so finding a safe spot and keeping watch for approaching enemies while healing is important. So taking hits is not ideal despite being able to regain HP for free. Along with its excellent flow, the gameplay also features an element of organic difficulty. Starting off, the player will probably get hit a lot and will end up stopping often to heal to play it safe. But as you get better, you start to naturally move faster and taking less hits. Character attributes play a role too. Adol and all enemies have a strength and defense stat. Your strength has to be as much or above a monster's defense to be able to damage them. How high your defense is compared to their strength, on the other hand, dictates how much damage you take if they hit you. Experience is also a factor. Each level increases your HP, strength and defense. There are only 10 experience levels in Ys I, and you will and must reach level 10 by the end of the second dungeon. As such, the difference in power between two levels is immense. This can lead in situations where enemies in a new area are very difficult to fight until you level up once, or situations where a boss will be far too easy or far too tough depending on how much you grinded. While it can cause an imbalance of difficulty, there is also a very strong sense of progression and growing stronger, which is one major charm of the Ys series. You can also press caps lock to switch between fast and slow modes for the game. The faster the CPU of the computer is, the bigger the difference. On Project Egg the difference is minimal. At 8 MHz the difference is far greater. The game only has 3 dungeons, with the last one being roughly half of the entire game on the first playthrough. By the time you reach the final dungeon, you're at level 10, so the difficulty becomes more balanced at that point, and experience won't affect it. There's less incentive to kill enemies though, as you've no use for gold or experience in the final dungeon. They do often get in the way and you have to defeat them regardless. Some bots try to add level into the final dungeon, and it mostly managed to disturb the dungeon run, which is already a pretty rough task, at least on the first time through. I already mentioned boss battles. Ys has plenty of them relative to its length. The first boss will already teach the player that the rule of bumping enemies off center doesn't apply to bosses. Rather, all bosses have an attack or a part that is lethal and a part that you should hit. It's satisfying learning their patterns, and fighting them puts both natural reflexual reaction and pattern memorization to a test. There is one rock boss that's usually best beaten by just running circles around it, but otherwise the bosses are great. Of course, they are all very simple, it was the end of the 80s after all. Another major gameplay element in Ys I are dialogue and item-based puzzles. Almost always when an NPC laments losing an item or something, you have something to gain by finding said item and returning it to them. The game definitely wants you to learn this, as there's also a part that punishes you quite frustratingly if you do not realize the puzzle. There's also parts where you have to use items you found in order to find a new path. Dungeons especially require to find keys or solve item-based puzzles in order to progress. The dungeons are designed so that the actual path between the end and the entrance is short, but you have plenty to explore and solo off the main path in order to open up said path. If you ever need to backtrack or have a reason to leave the dungeon before you're finished, it's conveniently done. An exception to this is the final dungeon, but there's little reason to return to the lower levels if you explore thoroughly and solve puzzles properly. Modern players find the puzzles very cryptic, but there's a hint to everything if you just talk to people. In old games like these, it was very important to talk to NPCs and learn hints and figure things out based on those hints. There are also items you can find or buy to help you out. A healing potion that heals all of your HP. Only one such potion can be carried at a time. A wing which you can use to teleport back to the first town. And a mirror which you can use to freeze all enemies on screen if you get in a tight spot. There are also rings, one of which I mentioned before, which give you bonuses like more strength, more defense, slowing down enemies and so on. Neither the rings or the items work in boss battles though. Graphically, Ys is probably weird to most people these days, but it has a bright color scheme, and for an old computer game, the textures are detailed despite being very patterned. The top-down view is also well done, and there's a sense of depth to the areas you explore. The enemy designs are also cool, although there's way too many armored knight monster things. Most importantly, the graphics are very clear and you can see what's going on really well. With Project Egg, there is some slowdown in some areas, but real PC-88 models with at least an 8 MHz CPU should run the game well, and on other emulators the CPU speed can be set. The framed head-up display is also very large, but it has its charm and it's fast to get used to. Some sound effects can be pretty screechy, but a really good function to it is being able to easily tell apart whether the idol or the enemy is taking damage, so you don't have to pay that much attention to health bars. The music is outstanding. Along with the large amount of versions and ports Ys has, there's a ton of soundtracks and rearranges for the music. Yusako Shira and Mieko Ishikawa composed the music for Ys I. It's very melodic and has a lot of variety between both emotional tracks and upbeat rock or beat music like action music. Sadly, there was a lot of unused music, which you can actually listen to by loading disc 2 and holding down the keys Y, S and Enter at the same time. Some of these tracks were actually used in some of the later versions of Ys I and II. Ancient Ys vanished. The final chapter, more commonly known as Ys II, was released in 1988. It's a direct sequel to Ys I, continuing right after the end of the first game. Together they form a duology for the story set in Esteria. All the foreshadowing from Ys I culminates in Ys II, and I don't want to reveal what exactly is going on in Ys II in case you don't know, because it's very exciting and satisfying to experience the story by yourself, even if some people like to act that it doesn't matter just because it's an old game. Ys II puts a spin on Ys I's gameplay with a magic system. The most important magic spell is the fire magic, which allows you to cast fireballs at enemies. This gives the game a shooter-like element. Some players lament that magic breaks the game, especially with an item that makes the fireballs home at enemies, but if you like bumping a lot, you can still keep bumping enemies if you don't find it absolutely necessary to fight them with everything at your disposal. One certain step down in challenge is that enemies don't get faster as the game progresses as they do in Ys I. The bosses also rely on the fireball magic, and are very similar to shoot 'em up boss fights. There are 2 fights at the end of the game that can only be beaten by bumping though. A lot of players run into the first boss having no idea they need magic to win, unless they explore the first dungeon thoroughly. The bosses are still challenging, so don't expect the game to be a complete cakewalk despite the addition of the fireball feature. But if you find it too challenging, you can always grind a level or 2 to increase your stats. You can also run out of a boss room in Ys II if your level is so low you can't even damage the boss. There are some auto spells too. Some of them have combat uses, but some of them are needed for puzzle solving. A special spell that lets you turn into a cute citadel demon. You can talk with enemies and learn hints from them, and sometimes some hilarious dialogue too. The dungeons are larger and can be more confusing than the ones in Ys I, require more navigational skill and more memorization. They are generally frowned upon by people not used to exploring large stages or dungeons, but they are loved by those who are. The dungeons are pretty easy to memorize if you just explore them systematically. The first dungeon has some issues though. Enemies block the doorways, sometimes making it hard to pass through without taking damage, and there are a lot of cramped spots. The beginning can be rough, but once you can access the magic, it gets more smooth, and the dungeons after the first one don't share the same issues. Item-based puzzles are still there, but there's far less NPCs who want to retrieve things. Ys II is still a bit longer than Ys I, and features 4 dungeons, the last being almost half the entire game once again. This time it's built more horizontally, so it's not going to punish you as hard if you need to backtrack. There's more experience levels now too, so the inflation is far lesser. It's not that easy to overlevel yourself against bosses. It still carries the strong sense of progressing and growing stronger, so Ys II definitely improves on that aspect. Music is still fantastic and from the same composers. Graphics are mostly the same. They put some more imagination to the boss and enemy designs too. The PC-88 originals are only available in Japanese. Ys I and II were also released for the MSX architecture computers. Like with the PC-88, I'm not certain of exact model compatibility, but those are always written on the game boxes. The MSX versions play pretty much the same as the original. The textures and colors are a bit different and slightly more plain. There's also different music for the title screen, the main dungeon, final dungeon, ending scene and the end credits. But they are composed by the same people and the quality matches the originals. The MSX versions of Ys I and II have also been translated to English and even Spanish. Ys I and II were also ported for the Sharp X1 computers. This one has some differences in colors, sound being a bit different and having the same music changes as the MSX version. It does lack a game over music for some reason. This one's only in Japanese. Fujitsu Micro 7 also received its version of Ys I. In this one, for movement you don't hold a direction, but you tap a direction on the numpad and Adol runs that way. You can stop him by pressing 5, which is the button in the center of all direction keys on the numpad. Control like this is pretty awkward. Apparently this was the case with many ports to FM7, including Falcom's Dragon Slayer. Otherwise this version plays just like the PC8801 original. This version looks very similar to the X1 port. The FM7 version of Ys I doesn't have a game over music for some reason either. Ys I and II also received a port for FM77AV, an upgraded model of the FM7. It has improved music, but the music tracks are the same as in the original. It does not share the tracks with the MSX version. Direction control is normal again. You hold the buttons instead of tapping them once for automatic running. The music also resets when moving from some screens to others, mostly when you move from one floor to another in a dungeon. Also when you open your inventory and go back to the game screen. It does disturb enjoying the otherwise great soundtrack. Ys II doesn't suffer from this issue though. The Fujitsu Micro 7 versions are all in Japanese only. Ys I was also released in English for disk operating system computers, ported by Unlimited Software Incorporation. It was published by Kyodai in 1989. The graphics don't look that good and the music is limited to a single voice channel without any sound effects. This might be an emulation limitation though. It's hard to know real technical limits without actual hardware. However, it does play pretty well. One notable difference in this version is that when you push enemies to a wall, they stay pinned to the wall. This can make the game easier, especially in more cramped spaces. In this version, Adol is called Arik. A lot of names are different from the original too. The translation is also funny in a few spots. This version also comes with a quality of life feature for picking up treasure. You can press a button to skip the item to get sound, and press a button again to move on from the text window. It's not in any version of the game besides this one and the PC98 and X68000 versions, which we'll talk about soon. This version with the same assets was also released on the Apple II GS line of computers. It comes with sound effects and more sound channels. Some of the music arrangement is pretty messed up though, as there's a few parts that are off note. This version isn't that good to play on an emulator. If you don't keep very notable pauses between pressing buttons, Adol or Arik stops moving. People who have played it on real hardware have not given the same complaint. Ys I and II were ported to the Nintendo Family Computer in 1988 by Victor. This is one of those Victor ports that are not very good. It has a lot of content of its own and not in a good way. The first horrible thing about this port is that Adol has to move very close to the edge of the screen before the game actually scrolls. This results in enemies often running into you before you can react to them. If you don't want to get hit, you have to move forward slowly. And this ruins the whole idea behind Ys gameplay, which is moving faster as you get better. They also added a ton of trees into the first field area, where you're supposed to learn to use the bump system. Now it's just obstructed with a lot of unnecessary obstacles. Another thing worth mentioning is that enemies deal random damage to you. One hit can either be almost nothing or take almost all of your HP. They added some other changes to the field maps too, like bridges which are only 1 square wide. The original game has its share of narrow hallways, but putting things like this on the field where you have to bait enemies out before you can move forward also wages war against the convenience of moving around. They even added really obscure verbal puzzles for entering the second dungeon. Dungeons also have some differences in layout. The first dungeon isn't particularly worse, but the second dungeon is much harder to navigate and the final dungeon is messy too. The final dungeon also lacks the balcony areas, and while it's more convenient to go from one room to another without those, there's also no place to stop and rest for faster healing, and the immersive value and sense of scale those balconies brought is gone. The dungeon is also in a nasty green color and that's not nice to look at all. The bosses are by far the worst offender in this version. The battles are either far too formulaic and easy to handle or way too difficult to handle. You end up just running in between a few spots until the boss dies, rather than reacting naturally like in the original boss designs. Some bosses are too difficult in a completely unfair way, being much faster than Adol without any trade-off. There's some new music here too. Some of these tracks are great, but not really worth playing this version for. For some reason the music in the final dungeon changes tonal speed on different floors. Ys I and II on the family computer were also fan translated to English, but I can't really comprehend why. Also sorry for the lack of footage for this one, but I really did not want to play this anymore. Stay far away from the family computer version of Ys I, it's a travesty. Ys II was a bit better. They made Adol run way faster, the screen scrolls at a better distance. There's not much changes other than some objects or items being in different spots. There's some changes to gameplay though. You can pin enemies to walls, making them easier to kill. They messed up collision for corners too. If you try to shoot a fireball past a corner, it eats up the fireball. And there's a lot of spots this game considers corners. They also changed the bosses. They're not as horrible as Ys I on the Famicom, but they're a lot easier than the original ones. Ys II on the Famicom isn't as much of a travesty as Ys I, but it's one of the worst versions out there. Ys I was also released on the Sega Master System. It was released in English too under the name Ys Vanished Omens. Adol's name was changed to Aaron in this translation. The translation also uses a lot of wannabe Old English manners of speaking like "to art" and "all that jazz." Other than graphics and sound, this version isn't much different. There's small changes to the maps, like a stairway that should be on the left side of a map is on the right side, but nothing too major. The gameplay is fine otherwise, but the sweet spot for bombing is in a really weird spot. You barely glance the enemy. If you are a bit closer to the center, you can still get hit. Movement is not grid based here like in most versions, so aiming is also a bit harder, but control is very precise, so I can't really complain about it. It does look great for a Master System game. However, on the Japanese side on the Sega Mark III, it uses FM audio for its music, which sounds much better than the PSG sound of the Master System. There are patches online to give the English version the FM music functionality, provided you have hardware to load it on that also supports the FM sound, and also a method to load custom ROMs, unless you simply emulate it. The Master System version is pretty good. Too bad it doesn't have an Ys II to go with it. Ys I and II were also ported to the NEC PC9801, NEC's next generation computer after the PC88. This version looks very similar to the original game, but the textures have larger resolution. PC98 also has very clear fonts for Japanese characters, so it's much easier to read as well. It also comes with better sound. There are two changes in the actual gameplay. You can cancel the item get sound when you open a treasure chest to move along faster. There's also more smaller balconies near the top of the final dungeon, making it a bit faster to move around in. They are small differences, but they are still there. Depending on the computer model's CPU, this game can run really fast and it's a real blast to play. If you want to play Ys I and II on an old computer, PC98 is likely the best choice. Sadly, it's only available in Japanese. Ys I received a port for the Sharp X68000 by Dempa. This version is infamous for its weird art direction, but it's not the worst problem this port has. The gameplay has some not so good differences. First off, idle and enemies both move slower vertically than they do horizontally. Not only that, but the sweet spot for bumping enemies horizontally is extremely small and hard to hit. You also can't do the flip trick to enemies near walls, but you can probably pin them to the walls either. There's also a lot more enemies. They just keep spawning and never seem to end. And a lot of them are so much faster than idle that it's almost impossible to fight them properly. They completely botched the gameplay for this version. The boss battles are pretty good though. The second boss in this version is actually the best edition of said boss. As in some versions it's too hard to kill without taking damage, while in other versions it's too easy to kill. There's also some changes to the maps. The first and last dungeons are the same, but the second dungeon was changed into a weird mess of cramped tunnels. Remember when I said there's a lot of enemies spawning? It's not exactly a fun dungeon to go through since you don't have a lot of room to fight. In the original the dungeon is dark and you can't see much around, but at least you have room for fighting enemies. They also made the field area outside a lot smaller. One thing this version does better is changing around the experience and damage rates so that you still can level up in the final dungeon. They did also change HP, and in early game you have so much HP you can just tank through the endless waves of enemies the game throws at you. Idle also glances off corners, so it's easier to walk through doorways and you can't see enemies at the doorways anymore. Graphically it looks weird since they went for a darker, more western-like art direction, including those weird digitized real people looking sprites. It also looks very clean and has nice water effects too. Bosses also look like they could be 3D models, but they are most likely 3D sprites. There's even reflection effects in some places. The sound quality is great, but sadly the music arrangements are either very simple or use unfitting instruments. They also added some extra music for Tepic Village and the area near the shrine. If you're learning Japanese, this version also has very clean fonts, and it's also one of the few versions of Ys I that has kanji in it. Too bad this version isn't also enjoyable to play. In 1989, NEC PC Engine received a combined Ys I and II on CD-ROM in Japan. It was developed by Hudson, the software developers for said NEC platform. It was also released on the PC Engine's US side on Turbografx-CD in 1990. It's also the first RPG to be released in CD-ROM format. There's a bunch of changes compared to the original. There are some animated cutscenes that were breathtaking for the time. Major NPCs also have large animated portraits of their faces appear to speak voice-acted dialogue to you at times.
Are you here to rescue me? How wonderful it would be to escape these chains. I have been locked up here for too long. My name...
Something that slowly became a staple in RPGs years later, but also used by CD-ROM RPGs on the PC Engine in that era that never made it outside Japan officially. The English voice acting is also pretty great and also featured professionals from some cartoons of the time. One weird thing in the translation though is that the monsters are called goons, as if they were some sort of gang terrorizing Esteria instead of just being monsters. Another bonus of the CD-ROM format's storage size is the Red Book audio soundtrack. All the background music are records of real instruments rather than being played by the game platform itself on the note file, and it sounds great. Sadly, some of the music that should have been here didn't get in, like the boss battle music from Ys II, so Ys II in this version still uses the boss music from Ys I. It's also got great new graphics. Everything looks a lot cleaner than in any of the previous versions. And it hasn't cut down on the texture detail either. The footage I've got here doesn't really compare to how it looks on a real TV without recording hardware between the inputs. There are some gameplay changes as well. The most important one is the combining of two games in one. Once you beat the Ys I portion of the game, you will reach the Ys II portion of the game right after. The Turbografx release also marked the first time Ys II was released in English. One major effect of this, other than not having to buy multiple games or swap cards or disc around, is combined experience points. You can keep leveling in the final dungeon of Ys I, and this gives you extra incentive to keep killing monsters, which was missing from the original. However, it can also be considered a downside by some, since you have to keep grinding a lot more in the final dungeon than earlier in the game. But the dungeon itself can already be quite a hurdle in itself, at least on the first playthrough. Grinding is also a lot faster until you hit that point where even the strongest enemies you can reach give you only 1 point per kill. On the flip side, the fast leveling also makes it very easy to overlevel. A lot of mooks are also very slow compared to older versions of the game, so this version can be considered the easiest one out there for the most part. Idle also slides off the corners of the doorways, so you no longer can chase monsters with doorways, and the monsters also can chase you with the doorways. Then there's the further improved slow and fast options. You can switch between two run speeds for the game. It doesn't necessarily make things easier or harder except for some boss battles, but the fast mode makes moving around very convenient and boss battles more exciting to play. Sadly, this version has pretty wonky physics and hitboxes. Often when you run straight at the enemy you don't take any damage. Sometimes you take damage even if you're off center. Sometimes if you're faster than the enemy you pass through them, but they might still drag behind you and take another hit. I never really noticed these issues on my first playthrough of the PC Engine version, which was the second version I played, but it was much more noticeable after playing a lot of computer ports of the game which had much more solid physics and hitboxes. Even weirder things can happen. If you use the fire magic to damage the enemy but knock them to a wall, sometimes they instantly bounce back multiple meters, even behind you at times. There's also one puzzle that might be tough to solve because an item you need for it lies on the ground but you can't see it. Some bosses are also a slight drop in quality. One boss is a lot slower compared to other versions. Two bosses have really weird hitboxes and are very hard to hit without taking damage. Another one's patterns are a bit messy. They're not a big step down, but they're still a bit worse than in the original. It's also funny how the rock boss, which you would normally try to kill with the DPS raise, is actually viable to kill without taking damage. So that one is actually an improvement. The final boss on the Ys I side is also either super hard or super easy, and this mighty change in damage comes only with one level, so you can't even use the RPG mechanics to adjust it well. The Ys II side of the bosses don't really have any specific issues though. This version is also quite overrated as it has its share of flaws, but it's still a pretty good version of Ys I and II, mostly with the benefits of the CD-ROM format. There are a lot of things that were done better with other versions though. Still, if you have a PC engine, you might want to check it out. It's also available on the Wii Virtual Console in some regions and also on the Japanese PSN, but only in Japanese. You might also want to play it just to see how ahead of its time the game's sound and voice acting was. Ys II received a major remake on IBM computers in South Korea by Mantra in 1994, titled Ys II Special. To this day it's only available in Korean. This can be considered a whole game of its own. It shares a majority of its story elements with the original Ys II, but also has some of its own. There's also a rescue mission in the beginning of the game that was probably taken from the Ys II original video animation. Some people say Ys II Special story is based on the anime, but that's not true. Only the beginning has one element taken from it. I mean, sure, I can't read Korean, but as far as visual implications go, there's nothing aside from what I mentioned that would connect with the original story elements of the Ys II anime in any way. There's also some fantasy elements that don't belong in Ys at all, like elves and dwarves. A major change to the basic gameplay is the addition of a melee attack. You can still bump enemies to death, but you can also swing your sword around. Bumping doesn't seem to work on bosses at all from my experience. Enemies can do both bumping and manual attacks too, so it's ideal to approach them off center like in the original, but keep swinging your sword as you get close before they hit you with their own attack. You can also move and bump diagonally too. Bumping is not that easy to do this way though, so I recommend you keep using your manual attack for that. Magic is a bit less important. You get all the same spells as in Ys II, but the fireball spell for one drains a lot more magic points, so the shooter-like element is gone from this game. This game also has more overworld maps and dungeons to explore than the original Ys II. Many dungeons are even more larger and more complicated to traverse than in the original. Item-based puzzles are still intact too, but since the game is in Korean it might be rough to figure out where to go and what to do unless you know Korean. You can only save at inns, unless you find an item from a secret area that lets you save anywhere. There is a temporary autosave whenever you go to another screen. You reload at the spot if you die, but it doesn't save to any slots, so you have to save manually if you want to turn the game off. There's also no rest feature, so you can't regain HP unless you rest at an inn or drink potions. There is an item that grants the usual rest ability from the original Ys I and II though, and also works in dungeons. It's also pretty grindy, so get ready to kill a lot of enemies before you progress too deep into whatever dungeon you're tackling. Another obscure thing to deal with are the aforementioned secrets. There's a lot of secret rooms you can enter by walking over specific tiles in the game world. Pretty similar to something like Shelter 2, only they're not necessary to beat the game in this one. I hear there's even a secret dungeon you can only enter if you haven't used equipment in your entire playthrough, except for the sword you get in the beginning and also lose soon after. This game also has a slow and fast option, but it can also run super fast depending on the processor of the computer it's played on. It's fairly fast with the fast option and very slow with the slow mode. You might want to use the slow mode for some bosses if you find them too hard to beat. There are also a lot of bugs and crashes that can happen. For example, if you try to leave a secret area, the game will crash. This can only be worked around by having the secret save anywhere item, saving before leaving the area, restarting the game, loading that save file, then leaving the area. The first boss also causes some nasty crashes on my computer now. Back when I beat the game the first time I didn't get this issue. Some of these crashes and bugs seem to be pretty random depending on what computer you are playing on, even if it's disk operating system emulation. On the disk operating system emulators there's a couple of moments where the game also crashes if you change the default CPU cycles. Ys II Special looks pretty nice too. I did hear that adult sprite was taken straight from another game though. Still, the graphics are pretty neat and there are some detailed shadows around too, although they do not move. The color range is pleasant too. The music arrangements are great, the sound is good too, but it can sound a bit screechy at times. There's also some really good tracks exclusive to this version. Ys II Special is definitely great, but the language barrier can make it even impossible to play, and there's not exactly much help on the internet either. It's not necessarily a good replacement for the original Ys II either. There's just something about it that doesn't make it complete in the same way, especially as it lacks an Ys I to go with it. I recommend you try to play it through though if you like Ys I and II. There's a thread on the ancient land of Ys forums that's pretty helpful for figuring some stuff out. And I too might even make a walkthrough if I manage to make the game work properly again. Ys I found its way to Sega Saturn in the Falcom Classics collection, developed by Victor and released in 1997. The same collection also contains the original Dragon Slayer and Dragon Slayer Xanadu with upgraded graphics. It was only released in Japan. Victor had previously developed the family computer version of Ys I, which was an utter atrocity. If the same developers were working on this, they probably learned their lesson from last time. The Saturn version is mostly faithful to the original and doesn't have completely ludicrous changes. There are still some good, some bad. The most important thing to note here is that the game has a Saturn mode and a original mode. In Saturn mode you can move diagonally, equipment and items are displayed in a single inventory screen. Most NPCs have large portraits when talking to them, and the game also uses kanji characters in dialogue instead of only using hiragana and katakana, in case you're interested in the language aspect of things. The original mode doesn't have these bonuses, it doesn't even use kanji in the dialogue, and for some weird reason they kept inventory and equipment in two separate menus even though they programmed them into a more convenient form for the Saturn mode. It's weird. As for the actual differences in this version, bumping has been changed a bit. When you hit an enemy, they're pushed back slightly. This always gives them time to realign themselves to try and attack you again straight on. So you can't really push the enemies, you have to hit them one bump at a time. This isn't necessarily worse, but I think it's less convenient and the original game's idea of movement while fighting doesn't work well, unless you can kill an enemy in 1 or 2 hits. It becomes excessively frustrating in cramped spaces. They also changed the bosses a bit, this time most of them for the better. There are some small changes to the patterns, but most of them work pretty well. The third boss has really weird hitboxes and I couldn't figure out a way to hit him without taking damage. And the damage I dealt to him seemed pretty random as well. The rock boss also throws random rocks around, so it's even worse than before. Otherwise the changes done to the bosses are okay. But there's a little something good old Victor had to completely botch on. The small boss changes were done with Saturn mode and diagonal movement in mind. So some of these bosses don't work that well in the original mode and are frustrating to fight. But there's one really good addition to the game as well. By holding B you can sprint. This can break combat however, because you can easily circle behind enemies to hit them from behind. But being able to traverse the world much faster makes for very convenient gameplay. The sprint doesn't work in boss battles. Ys II got on the Saturn with Falcom Classics 2 in 1998. including Azteca on the same disc. This time there's no separate original or Saturn mode versions. They added some videos of Ys I on the Saturn in the start menu with voice-acted dialogue scenes.
ありがとう。あなたが私をこの牢から助け出してくれるのですね。自由になれるなんて信じられない。本当にここから出られるんだ。
Ys II on the other hand only has one voice-acted scene and it's very short. Bumping is more similar to the original Ys II here. You can move and also bump enemies diagonally. Diagonal bumping doesn't seem to be very reliable until you have become considerably stronger than the enemy you're facing. This time you can also sprint during boss battles, which does pretty much break those fights and makes them very easy. Overall, this version is very easy to play. Other than that, Ys II on the Saturn is the same in terms of content with the original. The graphics are pretty good, but the colors seem kinda muted. They could have gone for brighter colors, especially as the character portraits are very bright but the game world isn't. It strikes an odd contrast. Adol also has his appearance changed as he wears different equipment. The sword and shield he holds changes and so does the color of his armor. They also added some cool intro effects to the boss sprites. The music arrangement is great too, although it's not really on par with some of the later ones or the PC Engine arranges. The gameplay can be weird, but it's not completely horrible. Considering these games come back with some other Falcon games, I guess it's almost an adequate apology for the family computer versions of Ys I and II. Ys Eternal, Ancient Ys Vanished, Omen was released in 1998 for Windows PCs in Japan. It's a remake of the original Ys I. It has completely new gorgeous sprite-based graphics with a fantastic color scheme, a lot of detail, and an art direction that remained mostly the same for all Ys games developed for PC for years to come. It also features a whole new port town where Adol starts off, a lot of expansions to the original areas like adding houses you can enter and talk to people in, physical space in shops you can walk around, and an expanded overworld area. There's a lot of NPCs to talk to and they have new things to say as the game progresses. A few new side quests were added and some slight environmental details to add to the narrative. They also added an intro animation that gives a quick rundown of how Adol got into Esteria. There's also a secret developer room you can enter if you know how. Along with new graphics and expanded narrative they added to the gameplay too. Adol can run into 8 directions and movement is no longer grid based. If you do a bad bump, both Adol and the enemy are knocked apart from each other. With a good bump you can keep pushing the enemy and they can no longer do that nasty 90-degree turn towards you that was in a lot of earlier versions. You can also pin enemies to walls. The gameplay flows really well and the way Adol moves fits perfect and is very precise. You can control Adol with either the arrow keys or your mouse. You can choose between double tapping to go from walk speed to run speed or always run mode. The always run mode with the mouse makes Adol move all the time unless you click a mouse button or the mouse becomes inactive from lack of use. I found the double tap option easy to get used to. It's kind of hard to aim bumping with the mouse control, but it's perfect for boss battles while the arrow keys are better for fighting the mooks. They also changed the bosses slightly. Their base patterns remain the same, but they are generally faster paced and have some little extra feature to them. Like the flames at the first boss dancing more widely as he loses more HP. The third and final bosses in this version are really famous for their difficulty too. And if you watched the Act 68,000 portion of this summary, I have to say I was pulling your leg. Ys Eternal was the best version of the second boss. The rock boss still kinda sucks though. There's also 2 soundtracks to choose from and they both sound great. They even added some of the tracks that were unused in the original and gave them perfect spots in the game. Ys II Eternal, Ancient Ys Vanished, the final chapter, was released next year. It improved on the graphics compared to Ys I Eternal and looks even more gorgeous. All NPCs have names now instead of being called old man or young woman or what have you. There's also a notebook that has little biographies for the characters you've talked to, and there's also a bestiary to fill. They added a lot of little Easter eggs. For one, you can shoot fireballs at people to anger them and see their reactions. You can also give them consumable items as gifts to either apologize or just make them more affectionate towards you. Some will even give you food in return. There's also some little extra dialogue to be read if you give NPCs gifts. Nothing too important, just a little bit of flavor to add to the world. Gameplay has also been upgraded. Diagonally bumping enemies now always counts as a good bump, so it doesn't matter whether you line yourself right or not, you won't get damage. This might make the combat sound much easier than before, but at points where there's a lot of enemies and you're not overleveled, it's easy to get surrounded. Enemies also have manual attacks they can hit you with if you don't have them locked in a bump. On the other hand, being able to bump enemies like this also makes the first dungeon a bit easier to start with. Enemies also don't follow you around unless you're in the same room, so they no longer fog the doorways. Eternal pretty much fixes all the problems in Ys II's first dungeon. Some extra treasure was also added and there's a healing herb to be found in each dungeon. The fire magic was also changed. You can now charge it to fire a bigger fireball. You're also no longer limited to one fireball on the screen and can shoot them more rapidly. There's now a cooldown feature signified by the transparent bar on the MP bar, which is depleted as you cast fireballs, so you can keep enemies away from you forever just by shooting at them. You have to give it a rest once in a while. These little changes in gameplay make combat more dynamic and it's more worthwhile to use both bumping and the shooter mechanics in tandem. Challenge is less trivialized with these changes. Just like in Ys I Eternal, the bosses are generally more fast-paced and also feature some extra aspects to their patterns. There's also 3 difficulty modes to choose from, with hard adding more attacks for the bosses. The final boss was also completely remade. Ys I&II Complete was released in 2001 for Windows PCs. Ys I Complete is almost completely the same as Eternal, but it comes with the graphical upgrades that we saw in Ys II Eternal. It has a new animated intro cinematic. It also comes with new music with some great new segments in the composition. It also features an easy, hard and nightmare difficulties. The difficulty only changes health and damage enemies have. I do have a feeling that bosses are a bit faster too in higher difficulties. Along with these changes, there's also a time attack mode you unlock after beating the game. You have to beat all the bosses in a row on normal difficulty and get timed results for it too. But if you die, you have to start the time attack from the beginning. Some good things were sadly lost in this conversion. The secret developer room is gone. They also changed the second boss fight into a lamer one. It doesn't track to you as well as before, and you just run circles hitting its side until it dies. The Eternal version of this boss was pretty much perfect. Boss physics were also changed slightly. This time when hitting some of the bosses you don't run through them, instead you are knocked back slightly. This can make some of the bosses a bit more challenging. Despite this, Ys I Complete is fantastic. Ys II Complete comes in the same package. It's pretty much the same game as Ys II Eternal. However, there's now a new nightmare difficulty mode and also a time attack mode just like in Ys I Complete. They didn't add to the music in Ys II in this release sadly. It uses the same soundtrack as Ys II Eternal. There's also an English fan translation patch for Ys I&II Complete. Ys I&II Eternal Story was developed by DigiCube and released for the Sony PlayStation 2 in 2003 in Japan. It's mostly a port of Ys I and II Complete, but with some additions. Other swords now come with passive abilities. For example, the short sword has a chance to stun the enemy, or the long sword has a chance to deal a critical hit, or the talwar randomly insta-kills an enemy. The battle sword counterattacks. That makes no sense at all since the game is rewarding you for getting hit. And the silver sword somehow keeps the enemy standing still while you bump them. Ys II also has another sword that instantly kills anything you hit from behind. Some of the effects being random is not a very good thing. In Ys I you have 50 levels instead of 10, making you grind in the final dungeon too. In addition, the enemies are pretty spongy, so the game outright makes you rely on the passive abilities instead of good old regular bumping. It's not very smart to create a problem to justify a new feature. Some of the weapons are outright useless. Since you can't deal enough damage anyway, you might as well hope for the insta-kill sword to kill the enemy. Especially with how the flame sword causes so much knockback that the silver sword and the talwar deal more damage per second. It's good for one boss fight though. On the Ys II side, the insta-backstab sword is by far the best thing to use against normal enemies. It's very easy to simply circle around them and kill them instantly. Enemies can also miss attacks on you, which I presume to be random. I did not recognize any conditions for this happening. The same thing happens in boss battles. The player shouldn't be given free passes like this. Back on the 50 levels in Ys I subject, it is kind of nice that they try to rebalance the levels. But as I already said with the PC Engine version, the final dungeon is enough of a hurdle, and having to grind there doesn't really add much to the game. If you're immersed into the narrative too, it's really lame when you're in a hurry but have to kill a bunch of monsters between each boss battle. Even if the grinding was fun, which it really isn't because of the changes the weapon system causes. It would work if there were less levels, but you have to get half of them in the final dungeon, and that's too much even though half of the game itself is in this dungeon. It just doesn't work that way. If you do like the weapon system, you can switch between each sword with the R1 and L1 buttons, so there's no menu hopping between them. There is no boss rush in the Eternal Story mode. Some characters are voice acted. This is pretty cool, but it also has a humongous problem to it. There's 1 or 2 seconds of loading between each voiced line. Whether you're listening to the conversation or trying to skim through it, you're in for a hell. It feels like some conversations last forever just because of the loading. The loading is not limited to voiced lines. Every time you go to another screen there's 5 to 7 seconds of loading. In the Ys II side it's 10 to 14 seconds. Even if it's just a small house or a small room you're entering. It's especially grating on the Ys II side because there's far more screen switching than in Ys I. Saving is also slower. I'm certain memory cards could save data really fast, but I heard Sony had this weird policy, requiring a text saying the game is saving or loading for specific amounts of time. You'd expect the PlayStation 2 to do much better with the loading, but not in this game. One more addition to the Eternal Story is the Dream World. You can enter the Dream World by equipping a gem you get in the beginning of the game and standing still. I'm not sure if it works anywhere or just near beds. Anyway, there are 2 NPCs in the Dream World who want you to bring some items to them. All of these items are new addition to the Eternal Story. They're just random stuff lying around like seashells or ribbons or what have you. When you do bring these items, these 2 will give you artwork to look at or music samples to listen to. So it's basically an art gallery and a sound test combined, disguised as a bunch of fetch quests. It's a neat idea. Now if you don't care about the Eternal Story's weapon passives or side quest content, or the huge level splitting in Ys I, there's also a mode to play Ys I and II Complete. They're exactly like the PC version, no Eternal Story additions, but it does have the load times. It is better played on the PC though. The game runs pretty well, but there is some slowdown if you fire too many fireballs or get hit by some of the attacks of the final boss of Ys II. There was one instance where the game froze too. The game is only available in Japanese. Check out Complete or Chronicles instead of this one, unless you're really curious to experience the Dream World quest stuff or just want to play Complete on PS2. Legacy of Ys Books 1 and 2 was released on the Nintendo DS in 2008. Its content and graphics are based on Ys Complete. Instead of 2D based areas they went with 3D rendered ones. It doesn't look too good. The maps were also split into smaller screens, far worse so on the Ys II side. Gameplay was changed a bit too. You can play with touchscreen mode or normal mode. In normal mode you control auto with the D-pad, but you have to attack manually. In the touchscreen mode you control auto with the stylus but use the bump system instead. Normal mode doesn't feel that good, your attack range is very limited. You can just hit once then hold the button while running at the enemy to semi-bump them. If you get the timing right you can hit the enemy a certain number of times before you get hit yourself. So you have to resort to trial and error to figure out how many times you can combo them. Otherwise you'll have to hit them only once and the combat becomes frustrating in micro hit and run. You probably remember me mentioning how the director of the original compared the bump system to popping bubble wrap. Well, the normal mode control in Legacy of Ys is more like yanking anal beds. Now someone might enjoy that, but you probably get the picture. In the touchscreen mode bumping is pretty hard to aim. Especially if you play with some small DS model that has a small screen and your hand is in the way. Or you'll have to hold the stylus awkwardly so that your hand isn't in the way. Even with these inconveniences there's more problems. In the original Ys II you need to have as much or more strength than the enemy has defense in order to damage them. In the DS version if you don't have enough strength you take damage. And because they decided to mess with the level rates, you'll have to grind many levels before progressing just to not get destroyed when merely testing the waters. Things become easier with fire magic, but Eternal, Complete, Eternal Story, Legacy and Chronicles all have some enemies that are immune to it. The bosses on Ys I side work well, but on the Ys II side you don't see the whole battle arena when fighting them. You also have to pick up the gold dropped by enemies. And you have to hold a separate button to run faster. There is no option for always run like in every other revision of Ys Eternal. There's a map to help you navigate around. It may be a welcome change for some, but I'd say that exploring and navigating without the help of a map is one of the main charms of Ys I and II, and it will really bring down the exploration aspect of these games. There's a new area added to the Ys I side, along with the new boss battle. The new area is fit with the story in an awkward manner. The extra area might be the only reason to even bother checking out this version though. The new area also comes with an extra equipment set which makes the one before it useless in the time frame you obtain it in. The Ys I side also splits the experience levels a lot for some reason. The translation is separate from the one used for Complete and Chronicles. It's good otherwise, but a lot of the translated names sound very weird. Slagf doesn't really roll off your tongue, and Palace of Salmon doesn't make you think of prosperity and wisdom as it makes you think of fish. There's really not much of a point in playing this version other than the extra area. If you need a portable Ys I and II, you should play it on the PSP instead. Unless the only platform you own is the Nintendo DS. If that's the case, I recommend you get anything else just to play Ys, because this is not the Ys you want to play. The music is good on Nintendo DS standards. The soundtrack on an actual disc sounds different from the one in game though. Ys I and II Chronicles was released for the Sony PlayStation Portable in 2009. It was released in English in 2011. It's basically Ys I and II Complete ported to the PSP. It features new art and a new soundtrack. The arrangement is great. At this point it's impossible to choose a favorite soundtrack for Ys I and II. You can also choose the art used in Complete or the soundtracks used in the PC-88 and Complete versions. There's also a minor musical reference to Ys Origin added to Ys II. You can control auto with the circle pad for circular movement that was done with the mouse in the Complete version, or the D-pad for 8 direction movement. It doesn't run as smoothly as Ys Complete, but it's generally not a problem. The frame rate drops a bit in some boss battles, but it doesn't really get in the way of gameplay. Falcon ported it to PC too. It's basically the PSP game ported directly to the PC with pretty minimal graphics options. You either have to play it with the PSP resolution or stretch it to fill your screen, resulting in some blurry graphics. Xseed released an improved PC port in 2013. It features a similar head-up display as Complete and comes with an aspect ratio better fit for PC monitors, and also way higher and sharper resolutions than the original port. It's available on Steam and also the Good Old Games Store. The PSP version is available physically on UMD and also on the PlayStation Network on the PlayStation Vita. This is the version I recommend to people looking to play Ys I&II for the first time, since it has the most polished gameplay, widest narrative, and by it supports Falcom and English Ys, and it's also more compatible on modern PCs than Ys Complete. However, it does lack the mouse control Ys Complete had, so if you want to play it with the mouse and Complete runs on your PC, then you can go with either one. That's a lot of versions. I hope you enjoy Ys I&II. And if you already played Ys I&II, I hope you learned something new thanks to this video. Now it's time for special thanks. First off, thanks to Paisage Kira for translating a few things for me that really sped up my project. Also thanks to my friend Hannes for letting me play Legacy of Ys on his DS, so I saw the technical limitations of it. Also thanks to my friend Joseph for helping me out a lot by giving me some important files and some important information too. Another thanks to the Basement Brothers YouTube channel for making the PC88 Ys video, which made me aware of the speed option and the sound test features. This project is now finally complete. I hope you enjoy your 30th anniversary of the Ys series. Thanks for watching and see you again.